You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Where are the armies now? General Hooker spent June 26th moving his army across the Potomac River. By nightfall, everyone was in Maryland except John Sedgwick's 6th Corps and a portion of the cavalry. Frederick, Maryland, Hooker decided, would become the Army's point of concentration. The first wing of the Union Army to cross the Potomac was comprised of the 3 corps under the command of Major General John F. Reynolds. Contrary to their orders, Confederate cavalry commanders Beverly, Robertson, and Grumble Jones failed to report this movement to JEB Stuart. Back in Washington, Lincoln began showing signs of doubt in Hooker. According to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, Hooker may commit the same faults as McClellan and lose his chance. But Lincoln quickly added a sign of hope when he said, "We shall soon see, but it appears to me he can't help but win."
Boys, you are now on the enemy's soil. Stack your arms and do pretty much as you please. Major General John Bell Hood, Army of Northern Virginia.
Lee, meanwhile, had risen at Williamsport, Maryland early on the 26th, made his way through Hagerstown, and arrived at Chambersburg around 9 a.m. Jacob Hoke saw Lee as he came into town.
He was at that time about 52 years of age, stoutly built, of medium height, hair strongly mixed with gray and a rough graying beard. His whole appearance indicated dignity, composure, and disregard for the gaudy trappings of war. Jacob Hoke.
Though incorrectly pegging Lee as 4 years younger than his actual age, Hoke paid close attention to which direction the general traveled. He managed to send word to Couch's headquarters in Harrisburg with the information he gathered. Just a short distance east of town, Lee halted and set up camp in a grove that locals used as a popular picnic spot named Messersmith's Woods. Lee's orders for Longstreet and Hill for that day were to rest their respective corps. Despite Lee's General Order 72, which empowered only certain officers with authority to requisition supplies and control rampant looting, Longstreet's men enjoyed themselves in Chambersburg. A good number of them found whiskey and other spirits. One First Corps man boasted that they had marched in 4 states that day, the 4th in a state of intoxication. One of Longstreet's artillery commanders and prolific diarist, E. Porter Alexander, noted how the roads had been muddy and hard for the infantry to use. So they marched parallel to the road, often through the lush wheat fields found alongside the way. Joseph Hooker, meanwhile, seemed bewildered. "He acts like a man without a plan," griped one of Hooker's staff officers, "and is entirely at a loss what to do, or how to match the enemy or counteract his movements." To Hooker's credit, he seemed to agree with his staff's assessment privately, if not publicly. The bluster he displayed leading into the Chancellorsville campaign no longer colored his words or actions. As he wrote to his chief, General Halleck, "I don't know whether I am standing on my head or feet." President Lincoln, his Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck all agreed that Hooker's conduct during the Battle of Chancellorsville was less than satisfactory, and they could not afford to have Hooker at the head of the Army of the Potomac during another major battle. Lincoln had reason to be cautious, though. To replace Hooker while an invading army was on northern soil may not have been a wise move, given the history of turnover for commanders of the Potomac Army. Instead, they would wait to see how things would play out.
It seemed pleasant once more to see smiling faces and to be greeted with friendly words. The women cheered us and waved their handkerchiefs as well. Charles Davis, 13th Massachusetts.
By June 27th, Lincoln's call for 100,000 emergency volunteers yielded only 12,000 Northern men to fill the ranks of the Department of the Susquehanna. 8,000 of them were from New York. In response, Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin called for 60,000 90-day volunteers to join the state militia. 24,000 answered that call, but regardless, there was just not enough time for them to be trained and mustered into service before the two armies met at Gettysburg. Meanwhile, the Confederate Corps commander Richard S. Ewell accompanied Rhodes's division to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, some 35 miles north of Gettysburg. Carlisle was home to the Carlisle Barracks, where Ewell had been stationed for a time before the war, and he spent some of that Saturday receiving visits from old friends he had met there. As pleasant as these reunions may have been, Ewell eventually commenced with his actual mission of gathering supplies. Once settled into his headquarters, he demanded the citizens provide his men with 1,500 barrels of flour, 5,000 pounds of coffee, medicine, surgical instruments, and other stores. Lacking a satisfactory response, Ewell ordered a house-to-house search of Carlisle. During the Second Corps' 3-night stay, the generals feasted on food left behind by the fleeing Yankee garrison, like iced salmon. A soldier of the 12th Alabama Infantry was determined to have a nice dinner at the National Hotel in Carlisle, where he registered in the midst of an unfriendly and rough-looking crowd of rough-looking men. Had a poor dinner rather ungraciously served by a Dutchy-looking young waitress. Of the booty captured in Carlisle were gallons of Pennsylvania whiskey. To celebrate the success of the invasion thus far, Rhodes's division put on a parade, during which a young, drunken lieutenant gave a speech that ran a shade too blue and had to be hauled off by his comrades. Confederate officers and men alike indulged in spirits and gave drunken speeches from balconies to their troops on the streets below. Earlier that morning, Joseph Hooker traveled to Harper's Ferry to inspect the 11,000-man garrison there. In response to his request to abandon the garrison and absorb it into the Army of the Potomac, Hooker's boss, Henry Halleck, said no. Feeling his hands were tied, frustrated and angry from the resistance above, Hooker tendered his resignation to the authorities in Washington on June 27th. Lincoln, without batting an eye, accepted. Meade takes command. It was 3 a.m., and so quiet at 5th Corps headquarters that the slightest sounds could be noticed. So it was no surprise that 5th Corps Commander Major General George Meade's slumber was disturbed by the sounds of voices outside his tent. There was a visitor to camp who was asking for access to the general. Being that Meade's staff officers were all camped in the vicinity of his tent, they too could hear the voices, and one by one would emerge, curious as to the matter at hand. When Meade lay down to sleep only a few hours earlier, he did so having fulfilled his duties for the day and was expecting to wake up in the morning and fulfill whatever duties he would be assigned for that day. He marched his men 16 miles from near the Monocacy River to Bollinger's Creek, 3 miles due south of Frederick, Maryland. Upon arrival, he went into the town to find Hooker, whom he had not seen since June 13th. Hooker had not yet arrived, so Meade returned to his corps, saw to their encampment, and retired for the evening. He was unaware that Hooker had resigned, and that one of General-in-Chief Halleck's staff officers, Colonel James A. Hardee, and a small party were on their way to meet Meade. Hardee roused Meade in his tent and told him that he came bearing trouble. Meade, whose sense of humor was just as groggy as he was at this hour, assumed that Hardee's mission was, as he wrote to his wife, to either relieve or arrest me. So Meade's response to Hardee's joke was, "My conscience is clear." Meade believed that he was being placed under arrest because of a previous issue with General Hooker. Hardee then handed Meade a communication to read, which relieved Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac and put Meade in his place. Unlike prior occasions when Lincoln replaced a general, this was not an offer nor a request. It read, "General, you will receive with this the order of the President placing you in command of the Army of the Potomac. Considering the circumstances, no one ever received a more important command, and I cannot doubt that you will fully justify the confidence which the government has reposed in you." It was an order, and Meade, ever the dutiful soldier, obeyed. And so Meade, Hardee, and Meade's son and staff officer, Captain George Meade, Jr., rode to Army headquarters in Frederick to meet with Hooker. There was little conversation among the three as they rode. Now and again, Meade, the elder, would depart from his visibly evident deep thought and ask Hardee a question. Then he'd go back to thinking. At Frederick, he met with Hooker, who, with his usual charm, tried his best to assuage the embarrassment and awkwardness of the occasion. They sat down and had a lengthy discussion and were eventually joined by the Army's Chief of Staff, Daniel Butterfield. Finally, Meade came out of the meeting with the same grave look on his face as when he went in. Upon seeing his son, he perked up slightly. "Well, George," he said, "I'm in command of the Army of the Potomac." It can be assumed that Meade learned about the disposition of the army, though he did admit that he had no exact information about the condition of the troops and the position of the enemy. He would also later claim that Hooker offered him no intimation of any plan or any views he may have had up to that moment. Meade formally accepted command and a message to Halleck. "The order placing me in command of this army is received. As a soldier, I obey it, and to the utmost of my ability will execute it." Meade spent the 28th poring over dispatches at Army headquarters to familiarize himself with the situation.
June 28th was spent in ascertaining the position and strength of the different corps of the Army, but principally in bringing up the cavalry, which had been covering the rear of the Army in its passage over the Potomac, and to which a large increase had just been made from the forces previously attached to defenses of Washington. Orders were given on that day to Major General French, commanding at Harper's Ferry, to move with 7,000 men of his command to occupy Frederick and the line of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and with the balance of his force estimated at 4,000, to remove and escort the public property to Washington. Major General George Gordon Meade, Commander, Army of the Potomac.
By that night, he had issued general orders for the Army's march. These ambitious orders set the Army of the Potomac on a collision course with the Army of Northern Virginia. The only question now was, where would they collide? Overall, Meade's appointment to command was well received, even though most outside of his own 5th Corps knew little about the man. A good deal of the rank and file wished that McClellan would be reinstated, and Lieutenant Henry P. Clare, the 83rd New York's adjutant, prayed that McClellan be placed in command once again. If not, then he prayed that Jeff Davis enters Washington, hangs Lincoln and all his damnable associates, proclaiming himself president. Clare was willing to part with a month's pay, to see Washington sacked and the present clique chased like bayed foxes with bloodhounds after them. In the high command, Major General Daniel Sickles and Chief of Staff Daniel Butterfield were among the few who were sad to see Hooker go. Sickles and Meade were not friends. The others were pleased with the selection. John F. Reynolds was the ranking general of them all, and Lincoln had offered him command of the army prior to assigning it to Meade. But Reynolds had seen how much Washington meddled with the army's commander's operations and respectfully declined the offer. However, he did suggest that George Meade would make a good commander if it came to that. Reynolds was also Meade's friend. When Reynolds first saw Meade after he took command, Meade told him that his new job was not only a surprise, but an unwelcome one at that. Reynolds told Meade that the commanding general could rely on him and that he was satisfied to see Meade at the head of the army. Things were now accelerated as though Meade's appointment so invigorated the high command and gave it a new sense of purpose and resolve. Meade conferred with staff and drew up orders announcing that he was placed in command of the army, along with marching orders for the day. Each corps knew where it needed to be by nightfall and by what roads, and by nightfall, all were where they should have been. Only Hancock's 2nd Corps was just a few miles short of its destination because it received its orders too late.
Carrying rifle, knapsack and contents, accoutrements, haversack containing rations, and 60 rounds of cartridges, over 50 pounds. Union 6th Corps soldier.
As to the progress of Meade's forces, Lee's army was enjoying the bliss of ignorance. Longstreet's and Hill's corps were concentrated around Chambersburg to the west of Gettysburg, while Ewell was split up between York to the east and Carlisle to the north. The 9th Alabama of Anderson's division of A.P. Hill's corps passed through Marion and Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. In his diary, one soldier recorded a touching event that he witnessed.
The females of Chambersburg seem to be spiteful, make faces, sing, wave their banners, etc. A widow in the place discovered the knapsack of her deceased husband in the command. She wished it, and the soldier gave it to her. He had picked it up on the battlefield of Gaines Mills, where we fought the Pennsylvania bucktails. Such is war.
Around 3 a.m. on the morning of June 28th, JEB Stuart's cavalry had finally crossed the Potomac and was in Maryland. But Stuart was east of the Union Army, which was east of his own army. Along the way, Stuart's men managed to cut the telegraph lines connecting Frederick, Maryland to Washington, D.C., stymieing the Army of the Potomac's ability to quickly communicate with Washington during this critical time in the campaign. Meade set up a courier service along the telegraph route, but this slowed information coming to and going from his headquarters. As Hooker had before him, Meade relied on Colonel Sharp's Bureau of Military Information. It was Lee's intention to hold the Cashtown Gap in order to protect his lines of communication, supply, and retreat back into the Valley and Virginia. A.P. Hill's corps took the lead east through the mountains to Cashtown, followed by Longstreet's corps. At the head of Hill's column was the division of newly minted Major General Henry Harry Heath. As his unit arrived at Cashtown, a gunner in Hill's corps was unsettled by the words of a woman along the roadside. "You are marching mighty proudly now," she shouted, "but you will come back faster than you went." Unable to resist the temptation, an officer asked why she thought that was. "Because," she quickly replied, "you put your trust in General Lee and not in the Lord Almighty." Up north in Carlisle, General Ewell declared this day a day of rest. Despite this, he sent Jenkins' cavalry ahead to Harrisburg, his next objective. Stonewall Jackson's former chaplain, the Reverend B. Tucker Lacey, held 2 church services at the Carlisle barracks. General Ewell was asked by local clergy if he objected to their offering their routine prayer for President Lincoln at their respective churches. Ewell replied, "Pray for him. I'm sure he needs it."
June 28th, Sunday. About 10 o'clock, a large body of our cavalry began to pass through town, and we were all busy feeding them as they passed along. It seemed to me that the long line would never get through. I hope they may catch the rebels and give them a sound thrashing. Some say we may look for a battle here in a few days, and others say it will be fought near Harrisburg. There is no telling where it will be. Sarah Broadhead.
General-in-Chief Halleck gave Meade a wide berth with which to command the army. In essence, he gave Meade what he denied Hooker. When Meade requested permission to pull 7,000 men from Harper's Ferry, Halleck approved. Part of Meade's orders placing him in command of the army also gave him the authority to promote, demote, or replace any officer to a position he saw fit. It was believed that the Cavalry Corps was especially in need of new leadership, and so between June 28th and June 30th, Meade jumped 3 promising young captains up 4 ranks to Brigadier General. Those junior officers were Elon J. Farnsworth, Wesley Merritt, and the long-haired George Armstrong Custer. Early in the evening of the 28th, Gettysburg resident Samuel Herbst, whose horse somehow eluded Early's Confederates on the 26th, rode the animal to the south towards Emmitsburg, Maryland, and returned with very welcome news. Thousands of Federal soldiers were encamped there and would soon be on their way to Gettysburg. One Gettysburgian recalled that the news flew through town like wildfire. Late that night, Lee was awakened and shocked to learn from a civilian spy in Longstreet's employ that the Army of the Potomac was concentrated near Frederick, well north of its namesake river, and closing in on his position fast. Lee was wary of civilian spies, but in lieu of information from JEB Stuart, and with Longstreet vouching for the man, he was left with little choice but to believe this spy, named Henry T. Harrison. Harrison also informed Lee that Meade was now in command of the Army of the Potomac. "General Meade," Lee said, "will commit no blunder in my front, and if I make one, he will make haste to take advantage of it." General JEB Stuart had ridden around so far from Lee that the Union Army now separated the two. There was no time for Lee to sit and wonder where Stuart was or why he had not received this information from him instead of a paid spy. He needed to act. No longer could he allow his army to be so spread out as it was. Nor could he push on to Harrisburg as he hoped, lest Meade attack him in the rear. Ewell's corps was in danger of being cut off and had to be recalled. Lee ordered Hill and Longstreet to concentrate at Cashtown, a small village at the mouth of the Gap in South Mountain, and ordered Ewell initially to Chambersburg, but then modified that order and directed Ewell to Cashtown or Gettysburg via Heidlersburg, some 10 miles northeast of Gettysburg.
On the 29th, the army was put in motion, and on the evening of that day was in position, the left at Emmitsburg and the right at New Windsor. Buford's division of cavalry was in left flank with the advance at Gettysburg. Major General George Gordon Meade.
On the overcast and drizzly dawn of June 30th, Buford's Union Cavalry encountered a small force of Heath's infantry at Fairfield, Pennsylvania. Deciding not to commit to battle, Buford withdrew his men and detoured back through Emmitsburg, Maryland, in order to arrive where his orders designated: Gettysburg. Around that time, at Cashtown, the brigade of J. Johnston Pettigrew took roll and then began its march east. Pettigrew's orders called for him to take 3 of his 4 regiments and a battery on a reconnaissance in force to collect information, and some wagons to collect supplies from Gettysburg.
It was told to General Pettigrew that he might find the town in possession of a home guard. But if, contrary to expectations, he should find any organized troops capable of making resistance, or any portion of the Army of the Potomac, he should not attack it. Major General Henry Heath.
Heath's orders apparently echoed Lee's desire to not bring on a general engagement until the entire army was together. Only a short distance into the brigade's march, and not far from Gettysburg's western limits, Pettigrew's advance party met a friendly spy who erroneously reported that a large force of enemy cavalry was already in Gettysburg. The cautious scholar general halted his column to await instructions from Heath on how to proceed. As the brigade waited, an unknown sniper took a shot at the 47th North Carolina, not far from the town of Gettysburg. The 47th's commander wisely backed the regiment off, even though the sniper didn't hit anyone. Pettigrew eventually continued on with his lead elements, gaining full view of Gettysburg by mid-morning. In Gettysburg, Sarah Broadhead's day began with relief. Her husband Joseph had returned, having walked for 36 hours from Harrisburg. Days earlier, he and other railroad workers were captured by Confederates, Sarah was told, and paroled and sent to Harrisburg. Joseph arrived around 1 a.m. on June 30th. But as one worry dissipated for Sarah, another sprung up. As Sarah looked to the west, down the Chambersburg Pike, there atop Seminary Ridge, stood the lead elements of Pettigrew's brigade.
We had a good view of them from our house, and every moment we expected to hear the booming of cannon and thought they might shell the town. Sarah Broadhead.
Think outside the bus and let Getty's Bike Tours show you the only way to truly experience Gettysburg. There's a reason why Getty's Bike Tours is the longest running bicycle tour company in Gettysburg, and that's because they put the customer's experience at the top of their list of priorities. Follow a licensed battlefield guide through some of the most legendary ground in American history. There's a tour route for everyone, from the newbie to the hardcore history buff. So go to gettysbike.com or call 717-752-7752 and book your reservation today. Mention addressing Gettysburg and receive 10% off your tour. That's gettysbike.com or 717-752-7752. Discount does not apply to rentals.
My favorite place to go, Mason-Dixon Distillery. They create their award-winning spirits from grain grown on Gettysburg National Military Park, and they cook their comfort food from ingredients sourced from local farms. For great food, amazing drinks, engaging conversation, and plenty of on-site parking, which is really hard to find here in Gettysburg, head over to Mason-Dixon Distillery, located at 331 East Water Street. Mention you heard this ad on Addressing Gettysburg and get a free dessert with any meal. That's right, I said free, just because you mentioned this show. That's Mason-Dixon Distillery, 331 East Water Street, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Victorian Photography Studio, located on Steinwar Avenue in historic downtown Gettysburg, is a vintage tintype and digital portrait studio. With hundreds of dresses and uniforms, as well as period-correct props and backgrounds, VPS can help you capture the perfect moment in time. As one of the few remaining practitioners of the craft, the photographers at VPS are trained in the history and artistry of wet plate collodion photography. So stop on in or book online for a truly unique Gettysburg experience. Go to VictorianPhotographyStudio.com and follow them on Facebook and Instagram at VPS_Gettysburg. That's VictorianPhotographyStudio.com and at VPS_Gettysburg on social media.
Dog tags in the Civil War, one of the most devastating Union defeats took place in Florida, Confederate Lancers in New Mexico, a camel as a regimental mascot. Learn this and more on the Untold Civil War podcast, available on iTunes, Spotify, and Buzzsprout website.
Gettysburg, a nation divided. The battle that changed America. Avatars, generals, artifacts, games, 360-degree views, an immersive battlefield experience. A new way to discover history. Gettysburg, a nation divided, an augmented reality, narrated by Scott Eastwood.
Download it from your phone's app store today and support Addressing Gettysburg by entering GBurg1863 in the referral code prompt after downloading. Do you have a local business in Gettysburg? Do you want to reach people who are itching to visit us, but don't know exactly where to stay, where to eat, or what to do while they're here? Well, then you should consider advertising on Addressing Gettysburg. You can reach thousands of Gettysburg enthusiasts per month who are within a 4 to 8 hour drive of us, as well as all over the world. Reach them where they are before they're already in town. This is the more affordable and more 21st century way to advertise. So contact us at advertise@addressinggettysburg.com for more information. That's advertise@addressinggettysburg.com. Meanwhile, 15 miles to the east, JEB Stuart was aiming to link up with Ewell at Carlisle to the north and hoped to reach Hanover before the Union Cavalry did. Stuart would not be so lucky. Riders approached him reporting that they had encountered Union Cavalry. It was the division of Brigadier General Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, who had received his Brigadier Star on June 13th and assumed command of the 3rd Cavalry Division on June 28th. A sharp cavalry battle took place in the streets and fields of Hanover, Pennsylvania. One of Stuart's aides said, "We stirred up the hornets." After slowly disengaging, Stuart withdrew towards York, having learned from a newspaper that Early's division was there. Back at Gettysburg, at around 10:30 in the morning, Pettigrew and his staff sat on Seminary Ridge. Field glasses and telescopes peered this way and that, searching for signs of the Army of the Potomac. Pettigrew advanced the skirmish line, which disappeared into the town along the Chambersburg Pike.
Our garret window afforded a clear view of the Chambersburg Road, leading up to the Blue Ridge 8 miles away. I went up to the garret, taking with me the small telescope which was used in the astronomical department at the college, a powerful glass. I could see on the top of the hill west of the town a considerable force of Confederates who had come down from the mountains. On the summit stood a group of officers, sweeping the horizon with their field glasses. Back of them, but largely hidden by the shoulder of the hill, my glass enabled me to distinguish men both of infantry and artillery commands. Suddenly, the officers on the crest of the hill turned and rode back, and almost on the heels of the retreat, a roar of shouting arose from the streets below me. I hurried downstairs and saw General John Buford's cavalry division, including 2 brigades, riding into Gettysburg from the Tarnytown Road. Professor Michael Jacobs, Pennsylvania College.
That cavalry was indeed the 1st Cavalry Division of Brigadier General John Buford. Samuel Hearp's news of the day before, claiming that thousands of Union troops were just down the road, had proven true, although he was actually referring to Union infantry coming from Emmitsburg, Maryland, not cavalry from Fountaindale, Pennsylvania. While surveilling the town before them, one of Pettigrew's staff spotted a long column of Union cavalry heading towards Gettysburg on the Emmitsburg Road. Keenly aware of his orders not to bring on an engagement if the Army of the Potomac is encountered, Pettigrew took immediate steps to withdraw back to Cashtown. When Buford's division of almost 3,000 cavalrymen reached the intersection of the Emmitsburg Road and Washington Street, it turned left onto Washington, with Colonel William Gamble's brigade in the lead, its 8th Illinois Cavalry at the head of the column, and Colonel Thomas Devon's brigade behind Gamble's. The dirty and sun-bronzed troops of the 1st Cavalry Division were unaware of what the last several days had been like for the people of Gettysburg. The townspeople were in a terrible state of excitement because of Pettigrew's recent advance on the town. The troopers were pleasantly surprised by the jubilant reception they received from Gettysburg's residents, who no doubt received them as their saviors. Lieutenant John Califf, commander of the only battery of artillery with the column, recalled a little girl emerging from the crowd lining the street to hand him a bouquet of flowers. Private Harter, in the 8th Illinois, recalled how a group of schoolgirls singing the battle cry of freedom moved the men to cheer.
A crowd of us girls were standing on the corner of Washington and High Streets as these soldiers passed by, desiring to encourage them who, as we were told, would before long be in battle. My sister started to sing the old war song, Our Union Forever. As some of us did not know the whole piece, we kept repeating the chorus. Thus we sought to cheer our brave men, and we felt amply repaid when we saw that our efforts were appreciated. Their countenances brightened, and we received their thanks and cheers. After the battle, some of these soldiers told us that the singing was very good, but that they would have liked to have heard more than just the chorus. Tilly Pierce.
Cake, milk, water, and beer were passed up the moving column. Doors, windows, and balconies were filled with ladies waving handkerchiefs. Altogether, it was one of the most touching, spontaneous, and heartfelt demonstrations my eyes ever witnessed. It inspired us to heroic deeds. Captain W.C. Hazelton, 8th Illinois Cavalry.
Buford wasted no time once arriving in town, making his headquarters at the Eagle Hotel on the northeast corner of Washington and Chambersburg streets. He sent Devon's brigade north to the area of Gettysburg College and Gamble's brigade west of town along the Chambersburg Pike.
I entered this place today at 11 a.m. Found everybody in a terrible state of excitement on account of the enemy's advance on this place. He had approached to within a half-mile of town when the head of my column entered. His force was terribly exaggerated by reasonable and truthful but inexperienced men. My men and horses are fagged out. I have not been able to get any grain yet. It's all in the country and people talk instead of working. Facilities for shoeing are nothing. Burley's people seized every shoe and nail they could find. Brigadier General John Buford.
Buford's complaint about the lack of help received from the townspeople was by no means representative of all the citizens of Gettysburg. Gettysburg youth Hugh Ziegler recalled, "The boys of the town would visit the camp and ride the soldiers' horses to water, and I was one of them." According to Howard Wirt, General Buford had orders printed up by sending compositors to the office of the Star, who quickly had and typed the orders which were placarded over town.
Sale of spirited liquor of any kind in this town during its occupation by the troops is strictly prohibited. Any violation of this order will be promptly and severely punished. The giving away of liquor will be punished the same as if for sale.
Some of Buford's troopers did have in their canteens Applejack, which they had confiscated in Maryland. That night, the soldiers served some locals' liquor. Lee, in the meantime, had moved his headquarters east to the village of Greenwood at the western entrance of the Cashtown Gap, which was presently flooded with Hill's divisions and supply trains. Back at Heath's headquarters, Pettigrew told his commander what he had discovered. Heath could not believe that the force in Gettysburg was anything other than local militia. Soon A.P. Hill rode up, and Pettigrew told him about his foray into Gettysburg. Hill insisted that the cavalry he saw was probably only a small detachment of observation. Pettigrew then called an aide up to tell the story. The aide, who was known to A.P. Hill, asserted that they were well-trained troops. Still, Hill, who had only recently spoken to General Lee, could not or would not believe that any Union force was close enough to cause any worry. As a precaution, he decided to send a much larger force to Gettysburg the next morning on a reconnaissance. All day long, Union couriers were flying from headquarters to headquarters with word of Lee's whereabouts and subsequent orders from Meade to his corps commanders about where they should be placed. Meade sensed that something was in the air for the morrow. Buford was reporting 20,000 Confederates in the area of Cashtown to the west. Buford's information came from a local citizens' intelligence ring. The ring was orchestrated by spy master David McConaughey. A young Robert McLean watched General Buford dismount in front of the Ditterline residence on Chambersburg Street. Buford seated himself on the doorsteps and addressed a dispatch to General Reynolds, conveying information which Mr. David McConaughey, Esquire, was communicating verbally to him. With boyish curiosity and regardless of good manners, Robert looked over the general's shoulder as he wrote. The curious Professor Jacobs of Pennsylvania College wanted a better look at what trouble lay just 8 miles up the road. So he took the telescope used in his science class to the cupola of the Lutheran Seminary on the ridge at the western end of town that bears its name.
I began a careful examination of the mountains to the west, where the Blue Ridge describes a semicircle. Wherever the mountainsides held clearings, smoke curled upward. About the fires, I could see men walking, attending camp chores, cooking, all the activities of an army held in leash. They showed me clearly as though they were not more than a couple of 100 yards away. And below me, within easy eyeshot, were both of Buford's Federal brigades. The tide of war was for the hour halted under my very eyes. Professor Michael Jacobs, Pennsylvania College.
Major General John Reynolds had moved his corps between Emmitsburg and Gettysburg along the Emmitsburg Road. The Moritz Tavern, roughly 8 miles south of Buford's position, would become Reynolds' headquarters. He summoned Major General Oliver Otis Howard of the 11th Corps, and the two shared a meal. We had cheerful conversation on ordinary topics during the meal, Howard would later write, and then retired to a back room, where the general read me some communication he had received from General Meade, requesting us to animate our troops in view of the struggle soon to transpire. General Reynolds treated me with the most marked confidence. Now, all roads lead to Gettysburg. Back at Gettysburg, Buford learned that his division of 2,900 men was outnumbered by the Confederate forces at Cashtown under A.P. Hill. As Buford figured it, Hill was the immediate threat, being only 8 miles or so away. Still, his line would cover both the northerly and westerly approaches, with Colonel Thomas Devens' brigade covering points north, or the division's right, and Colonel William Gamble covering points west, or the division's left. Both lines of battle posted outposts miles ahead of the main line to slow any Confederate advance. Buford's plan was to conduct a defense in depth in order to buy time for Reynolds to bring up the infantry. His main line sat on McPherson's Ridge, facing west down the Chambersburg Pike, which ran on an east-west line. His skirmish line was placed roughly 2 miles west of McPherson's Ridge. If Confederates were to approach from that direction, his skirmish line would be able to slow their advance before they would reach the main line. Buford's signal officer left an account of the situation on the evening of June 30th. It demonstrates Buford's realism and no-nonsense personality.
On the night of the 30th, General Buford spent some hours with Colonel Tom Devon, and while commenting upon the information brought in by Devon's scouts, remarked that the battle would be fought at that point, and that he was afraid it would be commenced in the morning before the infantry would get up. These are his own words. Devon did not believe in so early an advance of the enemy, and remarked that he would take care of all that would attack his front during the ensuing 24 hours. Buford answered, "No, you won't. They will attack you in the morning and they will come booming. Skirmishers 3 deep. You will have to fight like the devil to hold your own until supports arrive. The enemy must know the importance of this position and will strain every nerve to secure it, and if we are able to hold it, we will do well. First Lieutenant Aaron Brainerd Jerome.
That evening, Meade was satisfied that Lee's army was in the mountains between Chambersburg and Gettysburg. Unaware of Lee's intentions, Meade ordered Reynolds to move his left wing to the place the following morning. Lee had no idea Federal infantry was within a few hours' march of Gettysburg like it was. As Major Daniel of Early's staff later said at the 5th annual reunion of the Army of Northern Virginia, such is war, a game of skill and chance, a game of chess and blind man's bluff compounded together. As the sun sank behind the mountains, Lydia Ziegler climbed the steps to the cupola of the Lutheran Seminary and soaked in the scene that spread out before her.
The campfires of the enemy were all along the Blue Mountain side, only 8 miles distant, while below us we beheld our little town entirely surrounded by thousands of campfires of the Union Army. As we stood on that height and watched the soldiers on the eve of battle, our hearts were made heavy. Many of the soldiers were engaged in letter writing, perhaps writing the last loving missives their hands would ever pen to dear ones at home. In the near distance, we could see a large circle of men engaged in prayer, and as the breezes came our way, we could hear the petitions which ascended to the Father in heaven for his protecting care on the morrow. However, many of the boys seemed to be utterly oblivious to the dangers threatening them, and were singing with hearty goodwill the Star-Spangled Banner, and many of the other patriotic songs which we love to hear. Lydia Ziegler.
The sun set at 7:24 p.m. on the last day of the first half of 1863. Any light on the land was man-made and hard to find. The moon, rising just after midnight, was almost full. As darkness blanketed the valley, there for the whole town to see out by Cashtown were the campfires of Heath's Confederate Division of A.P. Hill's Corps, dotting the mountains like stars in the night sky. It was the last night that the citizens of Gettysburg were able to delude themselves into thinking the war would pass them by.
Gettysburg, June 30th, 1863, 10:30 p.m. Major General Reynolds. I'm satisfied that A.P. Hill's Corps is massed just back of Cashtown, about 9 miles from this place. The enemy's pickets, infantry, and artillery are within 4 miles of this place, on the Cashtown Road. My parties have returned that went north, northwest, and northeast. They heard nothing of any force having passed over it lately. Near Hattiesburg today, one of my parties captured a courier of Lee's. He says Ewell's Corps is crossing the mountains from Carlisle. Rhodes' division being in Petersburg in advance. Longstreet, from all I could learn, is still behind Hill. I have many rumors and reports of the enemy advancing upon me from toward York. I have to pay attention to some of them, which causes me to overwork my horses and men. Should I have to fall back, advise me by what route. Respectfully, J&O Buford.
Captain Hazelton of the 8th Illinois Cavalry was in command of a picket post on the Chambersburg Pike near a farmer's house. That night, the farmer invited him and the soldier with him in to have supper. Hazelton explained to the farmer that he was on duty and couldn't accept the invitation. The kindly old farmer offered to hold his post for him while Hazelton ate. Eventually, the farmer went out to the men and chatted with them until late into the night. Hazelton, along with the rest of Buford's men, spread their blankets on the ground and replayed the events of the day in their minds. The encouragement given them by the citizens of Gettysburg made them feel capable of grander, nobler deeds than they had yet performed. In his dreams that night, Hazelton thought of the girls in Gettysburg that day and saw his own sisters waving their handkerchiefs. West of Marsh Creek, intersecting the Chambersburg Pike, over 800 men in the 26th North Carolina were busy setting up their picket lines. The night went without incident. In 3 days, 588 of these men would be dead or unfit for duty. Along the road between Emmitsburg, Maryland, and Gettysburg, Solomon Meredith's Iron Brigade of 1,830 men and officers camped with little concern of a battle looming on the horizon. 3 days later, they would be down 1,150 men, a loss of 63%. Confederates and Federals alike spread out all over south-central Pennsylvania and northern Maryland, bedded down on the roads to Gettysburg and immortality.
Invasion, June 1863, was written, narrated, and produced by Matt Callery. Directed by Matt Callery and Pearl Shannon. Characters voiced by Bradley Lee, Pearl Shannon, Patrick Gorman, Denise Chain, Bob Steenstra, Kelly Steenstra, Ron Bailey, Braden Border, John Heckman, Dave Wilson, Keith Harris, The History Dame, Ray Chancellor, Dustin Smith, Keith Harvey, Matthew McClanahan, Stephen Byers, Konstantinos Hassopis, Bo Brinkman, John Thurston, and Katie Von Diedem. Historical consultations by licensed battlefield guides Tim Smith, Bob Steenstra, and Louis Trott, with additional assistance from Matt Atkinson, John Hoptack, and Ken Rich. Music by Dusty Lee Elmer, Sarah Larson and Danny Stewart, Kelly Shannon, Cody Tinnan, the California Consolidated Drum Band, and the Federal City Band. Some sound effects courtesy of Quantum Era and Ty DeWitt. Additional voice recording engineered by Paul Kirby. Copyright 2020, all rights reserved.